Hi, welcome back to my channel. I thought I'd make a quick video here. I'm at Wheaton College, my undergraduate alma mater here, and just prepping for a presentation that I'll give in a week here. But I thought to get some feedback on an argument that I'm going to raise at Evangelical Philosophical Society. If I could get some some pushback in advance, that would be great. One of my research interests is philosophy of mind, and I'm convinced that the mind, consciousness, is irreducible to physical stuff. And here's the argument I'm going to raise for this position. Now, again, feel free to push back, give me critique, but I think this argument works, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be raising it. Here's what it's called. It's called the descriptive challenge for the irreducibility of consciousness. And it goes like this. If A equals B, right, we'll sort of start with Leibniz law. Leibniz law says if A is identical to B, if it's the same thing, right, then whatever true of A will be true of B. I might cough a few times because I'm getting over a cold here. But whatever true of A will be true of B. Okay, so if, let's say, you're wondering if that figure in the distance is the same as your dog, right? Well, if that's the same, if they're the same identical entity, then what's ever true of that dog in the distance will be true of your dog, right? So my argument follows Leibniz law and builds on a similar principle. If A is identical to B, then in describing A, I am describing B, or I should be describing B. Okay, so if that dog in the distance is identical to my dog, then in describing that dog in the distance, I should be describing my dog. Now, that dog in the distance might be all muddy, right? Might have rolled around in the mud, and I might I might hear a description of this dog and think that's not my dog. It's you describe it as all mud covered and whatever. But in truth, it is, right? In truth, you were describing my dog, even if you didn't know it, because that dog in the distance was actually identical to my dog. So my contention is this. If consciousness, conscious experience, phenomenological experience, that is first-person perception, is identical to neurological neurochemistry, neurological matter, stuff going on inside my brain or in my nervous system. If they're identical, then in describing one, I should be describing the other. So if my experience of hearing a symphony, that sensation of what it is like to hear a symphony, if it is identical to neurological stuff, neurochemistry, then in describing the neurochemistry, I should be describing my experience of what it is like to hear a symphony. Now, suppose you were to sort of put me under an exhaustive MRI, or you were even able to image every single bit of neurochemical activity in my body as I was hearing a symphony. If you were to describe that neurochemical activity, you would not be describing what it is like for me to hear a symphony. Now, certainly, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying consciousness or the experience is unrelated to the neurological basis. It clearly is related. There's correlation and even deep mutual relationships where they impact each other, right? If I'm asleep, if someone knocks me out, gives me a good punch to the head, then I won't hear the symphony. So they're certainly related to each other. But relationship of mutual effects, right? Relationship of mutual impact doesn't equal identity. So if they're identical, then in describing one, I should be describing the other. But here's what's interesting. If you tried to describe my experience of hearing a symphony by just describing my brain state at the time at which I hear the symphony, you won't describe my perception of the symphony. You will have described, of course, the neurochemical basis for that perception. You might even describe the neurochemical correlates, maybe that the stuff in the brain and in the body upon which that experience maybe even largely depends, in the sense that the experience wouldn't happen without those certain requisite happenings in my body. But you wouldn't have established their identity. And furthermore, you would actively disestablish their identity if it does turn out, if I'm right, that you haven't described my experience of hearing a symphony by describing the neurochemical basis of it. You know, in the paper, I use this kind of example of you can imagine, my wife being frustrated at me for forgetting to take out the trash or something like that, right? And imagine I was this brilliant neuroscientist, right? And I had this device that at that instant could instantly tell me everything neurologically that was going on in her body. Now imagine I said, "Hon, I know exactly how you feel." And I go on to give this description of her neurochemistry. Now, we would think that's absurd, right? But why do we think that's absurd? Well, clearly because the feeling of frustration is not identical to the neurochemical basis. Because if it were, then in describing the neurochemical basis, as I relate this neurochemical basis to my wife, at some point she should be like, "Oh yeah, you do understand what it's like for me to feel frustrated at this," right? Like at some point I should be describing her feeling of being frustrated. So if you buy this premise, and I think it's a very plausible premise, that if A is identical to B, then in describing A, I am describing B, then it seems to me that this argument immediately follows and establishes the non-identity of consciousness with the neurochemical basis. Okay, so what does that tell us, right? Now, there are certain forms of philosophy of mind, certain views you can take that will try to grapple with this fact, right? They'll recognize that, yeah, consciousness actually can't be reduced to the neurophysical basis. One approach is what's called eliminativism, right? So you can say that consciousness just doesn't exist. That our subjective experience, because it can't be described through the neurochemical basis, through the microphysical sub basis of consciousness, because we can't describe experience like that. Therefore, we're just going to brush it out of our account of reality. Now, some people do go that route. Daniel Dennett goes that route. Paul and Patricia Churchland go that route. Professional philosophers of mind. Obviously, I don't find that plausible. It's very hard to say consciousness is an illusion when there is what it is like to have an illusion. There is this subjective aspect to being illusioned itself. Okay, so some others will then try to hold on to what's called non-reductive physicalism. So that's this view that consciousness, while it can't be reduced to the brain, it is nevertheless physical. So though consciousness is wholly constituted as a physical thing, you can't reduce its description in physical terms. Now, frankly, I've always found this view to be just flatly contradictory. If consciousness is physical, then how in the world could it fail to be described in terms of what it actually is, right? If A is A, then in describing A, right, in using terms pertaining to A, I should be using those terms pertaining to A will pertain to A, right? If A is identical to B, then terms pertaining to A will pertain to B. So if consciousness is ontologically identical to physical stuff, that's its constitution, then it doesn't make sense to say it can't be described in terms of what it actually is. That seems to my mind to contradict this descriptive principle that I've outlined at the front of this video here. Um, so others then, of course, will appeal to forms of what's called strong emergence. And this view, of course, that I'm outlining here, at least, in terms of the irreducibility of consciousness, it's not necessarily set against emergence. One can be a strong emergentist and hold to this view. But strong emergence essentially claims this, that consciousness sort of emerges from the brain as a physical system, but is its own ontologically unique thing. It's a new kind of entity in the universe that can't be reduced to the physical basis. So that's interesting. Um, but I think part of the problem with emergence as an account in itself, strong emergence, is that every other example of emergence we know starts with the idea that emergent phenomena behave in ways that are unpredictable from their microphysical basis. It's not that they're ontologically something new. So if you take, for example, a hurricane is an emergent phenomena that is a mass coordinated behavior of microphysical things. And this behavior emerges out of these parts, and it's unexpected in a lot of ways, in that you can't predict the behavior. But there's nothing over there that's literally over and above the parts. Or you think about, this example has been used actually by a philosopher here at Wheaton, Dr. Bob O'Connor, of a magnetic field, and he tries to argue that the emergence of a magnetic field is an analog to the emergence of consciousness. But if you look into how large magnetic fields emerge, it's actually through this alignment of smaller magnetic fields. So there's nothing new there. There's nothing ontologically new over and above smaller parts, even though there's an emergent phenomena, this large magnetic field that emerges out of these smaller magnetic fields sort of unexpectedly aligning in a way that isn't entirely predictable. Where does that leave us then? Consciousness seems to be this thing that is irreducible. If this descriptive challenge goes through, it is irreducible to its microphysical basis, and therefore actually gives us a reason to think naturalism as an account of reality. That is the belief that everything that exists is purely physical. It gives us a reason to think naturalism is false. So go ahead. I would love to hear feedback and pushback onto this video and slash podcast. If you have thoughts, feel free to launch them at me. I'm all ears. Thank you for watching.